Okay, welcome everybody. I think we should start. My name is Wibier, and I'm technical evangelist with DevExpress. And I'm going to talk about using secure web API from a JavaScript SPA. Just to get an impression, is there how many people are already using web API? Quite a bit. And how many of you are using it in a secure way, like with usernames, passwords, that kind of stuff? Yeah, it's a bit less. And how many of you managed to get it to work with JavaScript on a client? Yeah, it's getting less. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. I will introduce you with a couple of things that come with Web API framework, and I'll do a bit of JavaScript coding, and I'll show you what is involved to get it all to work. So So the agenda is as follows. I will explain a bit about what Web API is and why we should use it. I'll show you quickly how to set up a Web API backend, and I'll show how to consume Web API. Well, before we start into the real coding part, let's discuss a couple of terms quickly here. You've probably heard most of them. We've got Web API, we've got REST, we've got endpoints, JSON, OAuth. Well, and that is basically everything we're going to deal with in this session. So Web API is, well, basically an interface of your back office application, which allows maybe other developers to use the business logic in your web app or in your backend with different client platforms. And yeah, as you can look it up at Wikipedia, it's like most of the times a subset of programming interface. Well, the cool thing about something like Web API is that you can, as I mentioned, you can set up your business logic only once, and you can have different clients. I mean, you can even have a WPF application connected to your Web API and use the business logic that you have coded in your Web API backend. But you can do it with JavaScript, TypeScript, basically, yeah, Windows, C#. You can have a C# application as well, obviously. And if you make a change in the business logic, you don't need to redeploy all the applications. So that is a pretty cool thing. Well, two of the terms actually which were mentioned in the shortlist was REST and HTTP. And well, the nice thing about Web API is that it is using the HTTP protocol in a way that HTTP was designed for. So that means we have a couple of resources in this case. As you can see, you've got a couple of URLs, and you've got a couple of verbs which come with HTTP. So you can, for instance, have a verb which is called a get, which is one of the verbs used the most, because if you have a web browser, you go to a page, you will execute a get request from the server, and that will display the information that you'll need. If you would submit a form on a web page, it will perform a post, which is a second verb. And there are two other verbs, which is the delete and the put methods, and they are not used frequently on websites, but Web API uses those particular verbs as well to do deletes and updates on your database or your backend. Well, endpoints is something which is used heavily on a Web API backend, and you'll see that there are a couple of endpoints pre-configured that we can use, for instance, to authenticate a user, to get third-party authentication in place, and all those kind of things. And I'll show you a couple of them, which are basically shipped if you set up a Web API service. Yeah, and then security is obviously one of the things which is, on a lot of places underestimated, but it is obviously very important to make your application secure because, if you wouldn't have a secure web API service, anybody could basically get your data or modify information or, do whatever things that you don't want them to do. So for that we can use an authentication mechanism which is called OAuth, and what that basically means is that we are going to exchange some credentials to a specific server, and in our case it is the same server as the Web API service, but it could be another one as well. So if you have like a large organization with a whole bunch of services set up and you want to have like a global authorization mechanism in place, you can use like another authorization server to get credentials for your specific web API. One of the things which is using this quite frequently is, for instance, Twitter or Facebook or any of those social media channels. You can actually validate your user against one of those parties and get credentials in return, which allows you to know who is dealing with your web API backend. If we have enough time, I'll show you how you can actually authenticate through Facebook. So you have to set up something in Facebook as well, and then you can actually use your own web API backend and use the authorization from Facebook. Well, there are basically two things involved. It is the authentication and it's the authorization. And this is handled pretty nice by the Web API framework. And the thing is, obviously, especially with JavaScript single-page applications, if you have a single-page or a JavaScript application, the end user, if he is using something like Firebug or some other tool, he will be able to, see what's going on in your application because it's all client-side. It's not compiled. It's you can just see what's going on. So you have to make sure that the authentication and the authorization is being dealt with in a secure way. And we'll see how that works. So let's first start by creating a small and simple web API service, and to see how you can close that down to have like only authorized calls on the service. Let me try to do this with one hand. So for this, I have Visual Studio opened up already. And I can just go by going to a new project. And in this case, in the Visual C# section, there is a ASP.NET web application. And this will give me the choice what I want to create. So I can go for a web application, I can go for MVC. In this case, I will go for Web API. And one important step that I'm going to put in is I'm going to set up the authentication on my Web API. In this case, I can choose for no authentication. I can go for individual user accounts. I can go for work and school accounts and Windows authentication. I will go for the individual user accounts. If you are working with an Active Directory or some other authentication mechanism, you can pick any of those. But in our case, I'll just go for the individual user accounts. And I will leave the unit testing, and I will also leave the Azure creation out of this application. So it's now setting up the web application, which will include one sample web API call. And I'll start with that simple web API controller. So what we see here is an application. This is our web API application, and it's got like one home page as well. So if I run the application, you'll have basically a one-page website which will host the API as well. And the nice thing about this whole project template is that if we're going to start adding some API controllers, you will see that there is some documentation section as well. So here we are. Well, this is basically the home page, doesn't do anything else. But there is an interesting thing here, because what you see is we have an API link on top of this menu. And if I click this one, it will go to a specific page which will already show all the API calls that we can make. And because I have created this web API project with individual user account authentication, you'll see that there is an account controller here, which has a number of methods. And I'm referring back to what I was mentioning earlier, the HTTP verbs that I was discussing. You'll see that this documentation is created automatically and it gets the verbs in front. So if I want to have user info, I can call the get methods. And you see that here. And if I can actually drill down here and you'll see some sample code as well. And this is all being generated automatically. And well, documentation of your web API is obviously an essential thing, especially if you're dealing with like other parties who are going to consume your web API. And you'll have a couple of things here like a JSON format. You'll have an XML format as well. Well, since we are dealing with a JavaScript SPA later on, we'll be dealing with JSON because it's a bit more efficient. And we can basically see the entire API as it is right now. So I've got like all the methods here to create a user, to authorize a user, to add an external login, etc. I can even change the password. And you'll see that a couple of methods are being done by a post method. What you also see is that all the way at the bottom there is like the values controller. And this is actually a real simple, straightforward values controller. It does do a couple of things, but it is just to get you started. It will return a list with values. In this case, it will always return sample string 1 and 2 as an array. And you could actually try, here you'll see the other verbs, the put and the delete method. You could try to delete anything, but if we switch to the code, and let me do that. That was the wrong one. If we switch to the code, we'll see in the controllers that we have this values controller. And I will make the size of the font a bit bigger. So here we see a real simple controller. And the interesting thing here is that it has an authorize attribute on top of it. And I'll talk about this in a bit. The get method of this controller just returns an array of strings. Really not exciting. It's got a get as well, and no matter what parameter you pass in, it will always return the text value. But it is just to give you an example. And then the post, the put, and the delete aren't even coded in. So it is just to show you how this works. If I now try to let me first uncomment this line, because this is the interesting part, and quickly rebuild the project. If I now access that controller, and by default everything with web API is something like /API /values, in this case is the name of the controller. And what you see here is the result basically of this web API call. You might wonder, why isn't it returning JSON? Well, the web API can return it in different formats, and that depends on the client. Because we're dealing with a web browser directly, it will return XML. But we can actually override that pretty easy. We can make sure that it will return JSON by tweaking one of the parameters in the application start. So we can do that by going to the app start folder, and in the web API config I can put in some code. I have to check my little notes. I was hoping for a second screen, but that didn't work for some reason. Let me see, that was going to be let me put down the mic for a bit. Fortunately, I have it already here as well, so I'm going to put that in quickly. So I have now made a small change to the configuration of the web API, and if I rebuild the application again, you'll see that it will return JSON. And before I'm going to start the application, I'm just going to uncomment the authorize attribute as well, because that is the thing that we're going to deal with. I will uncomment this line again and build the application. And once I start up again, we'll get something else. It's now going to give me an error message because, and you see it's in JSON as well, and that is how this is the simplest way on how to secure a web API call. So now it says, okay, you have not been authorized for this request. So we obviously need to be authorized first before we can do this. And this is where the fun begins basically, because how does that work from the client? How do we sign on? I mean, we can send in a username and a password, and then, I mean, we don't want to do that every time. So for that, I will use another application, which there are a couple of those little applications out there, but I will be using Postman. It's freely available, and you can actually test what we're trying to do. So if I just copy over this URL and I post it in here, can everybody see what's happening here? So I can request a URL here, and in this case it's going to be a get. So if I send it over, I will have the values. That shouldn't be the case actually. So if I do it again, we'll get the error message. And well, so we need to authorize, but before we can authorize, we need to actually create a user as well. The way we can do that is by going back to the documentation, and what we'll see here is we can register a user. And we can also see that we can actually use the Postman tool to create that user by using the web API. So what you see here is a little sample code, and I can copy that over, and I can now put that in here. I'll change the method to post. I'll change the API to the URL that we were going to use. It's going to be this one, register. So let me put it in here. And now it needs the data that was described here. I'm gonna add this to the body, and well, the easiest way is to do it by a form URL encoded post, and in this case I can just copy over all the elements independently. So I'll have an email, I'll have a password, and I had a confirm password. Well, I need to enter a couple of values here, so I will be entering my email address. Let me put in a real difficult password here. And this should obviously be the same, because if I do 2 different passwords, that will be caught by the WebAPI backend, and it will give me an error back. So I can now post this. So I'll put it to post, and I hit send. And what is happening now is that the WebAPI will actually be using Entity Framework for the database backend, and it has now created that user inside the database. Well, this is the first step, and I can actually now use this same account to authorize the call that I was doing earlier. So if I want to do this call, I first need to be authorized. So how do we do that? I will go back to the documentation section here. And I can now, what was it again? No, this is the wrong one. Well, I must be blind or anything. Because I just can't find the call right now. So, okay, let me have a quick check, because I forgot something probably. Okay, so the steps that are involved now is we need to get a token, and that is one of the endpoints that comes with WebAPI if you enable the authorization. So what we need to do is we need to authorize our username and our password that we just created, and we will get a token in return, and that token, we need to keep that in our application, and we need to send it across with all calls that we're going to do. So what we can do to make that happen is we have to change, and this is obviously something which does not come in the documentation section, and it is basically the same for all WebAPI backends, unless you override that. I can now hit the URL, and this is one of the endpoints which comes with WebAPI, where I also need to post in a couple of details. So the first thing that I will do, I need to take a quick peek here so we don't make any mistakes. So what I need to do here is I need to specify a grant type, because there are different ways of authorizing. And in this case, we are going to be authorized with a password. So I'm going to specify password as a value here. And in case we are using the grant type password, I can specify a username, which will in this case be donw@devexpress. And I need to specify my password as well. And that was test 1, 2, 3, like this. So I am now going to make the call to the token to receive a token, which is basically like the key that I'm able to use for all the subsequent calls. So if I send this over, it says I have an unsupported grant type, and that is probably because the password was wrongly spelled, I guess. Did I copy something incorrect? Let me have a quick look again, because this should work. Okay, so this is the body, grant type, username, password. That was all small, I think. One more time, password, username, and the grant type was password. And it was URL. It had to be this. Okay, basically it doesn't matter in which order those things are being sent over, so I can now change this one to username. And the password was small. Okay, so I was having the wrong post type. I was having the form data instead of the form URL encoded method, which is slightly different in encoding. But the most interesting thing that you see here is the response. And there are a couple of things which actually are pretty interesting, and the most important one is the access token, because this is something that we need to keep for the duration of our session. So it also has a couple of other things. It's specifying the token type, which is a bearer token, and what you normally do with a website is like a cookie-based authorization. So this ticket will be stored in a cookie, but we're now using a slightly different way, which is a bearer token, and this token needs to be sent over with subsequent calls. It furthermore tells you when this token is going to expire. That is by default pretty long. I think it's about a year. It further gives me the username in return that I already entered, and it gives me a timestamp when this token was issued and when the token will expire. And that is basically another notation of the expires in. So if I now want to do that call that I did before, which was the API values, what I need to do here is I will copy this entire token. And this is an encrypted string which holds some information. And once the WebAPI backend receives this back in a call, the Web API service is able to determine who this is. So it will see that it is donw@devexpress.com, and you can use that in your backend to do further processing. So if I copy over this value, we can go to the other values call here that was giving me the error message. So let me see that we have the error message back. And what I can do now is I can add some additional information in the header. And this is basically what is happening with the whole authorization part of things. So if I quickly check, because I had to add a specific thing into the header, and that was going to be the authorization header. So here we are again. I am now gonna add an extra header before we are going to send over this information. And what I need to put there is basically, because we are dealing with the bearer-based authentication. Where did my thing go? Here it is. Well, and I just copied over the entire token, so I'm going to paste it in, and it's going to be bearer space and then all of the token. And if I now send out this response, you will see that I have the value 1 and 2, and that was basically the initial call that I did without the authorization. So, yeah, this is basically what needs to be done. You've seen a couple of things here, so that's quite convenient from this tool. I can actually show what I've been doing. So I first have been doing the validation on the token endpoint of the Web API, and everybody who has a Web API configured with the credentials and the authorization will have this endpoint. And once I got that token in return, because I validated correctly, I will be using that token for the rest of my application cycle, basically. I could also put some extra stuff in the Web API backend, because if I switch over to Visual Studio, there are a couple of things here that I can do. I mean, I can actually add a number of parameters here, so I could specify a number of roles. And if my user is not in this role, I will get the error message on the back end. So this is one, or on the front end. So this is basically how you can prevent your Web API to be consumed by unauthorized users. So if we want to do this in JavaScript, well, you have been seeing me doing some of those calls manually with the tool. So let me quickly get back to this specific slide deck. So I have been using the authorized attribute on the Web API controller to close down or enable. I can also put some different attributes in there, because I could actually make like one specific call available for everybody by using the non-authorized attribute. And I can do that on individual action methods, as you can see. So I could also override authentication, or I can use allow anonymous. So if I would make this values method here, if I would put in the allow anonymous on top of this method, then all the other ones will derive the access rights from this from the class, and it will so you can really fine-tune your security level. So this is what we've basically been coding. And here are a couple of examples, like I only want to have specific users, Alice and Bob, or I want to have specific roles, which would make more sense because the amount of users are obviously changing quite a bit, probably. So That is basically one of the things that is makes it possible to get this all going. There is obviously another thing that you might have heard of, and I mean, in the example that we have been doing, the client was running from the same machine as the Web API backend. But if you would like to create a hybrid application which you would ship on a mobile device, so you would pack it up by PhoneGap and Cordova, then you might run into some problems. And also if you are facilitating your Web API to another party, what happens then is that you will run into an issue called cross-site scripting, which will be disabled by support by default. And that is a security thing that comes with the web. It doesn't have to do specifically with Web API, but basically if you have a site or a service running on host A, and you have the client running on host B, then the client is unable to make calls to host A because of this cross-site scripting. And that is something which is something we can overcome as well. And specifically, if you're creating apps which will be shipped on mobile devices, you will run into these issues. But fortunately, Web API has a couple of really nice things to solve that. And that can be added to your project by using a NuGet package, which is just freely available. And you can do that by searching for Web API course. And I do have a connection here. Yeah, so what we have is a package which is also created and maintained by Microsoft, is this particular package. So if you search for Web API course, it will add a couple of extra things, and we can configure a couple of extra things. So let me add it to this application, and it will also allow you, there are different ways to overcome the cross-site scripting issue. What basically happens is that you will need to provide a number of headers in the response of your backend to allow cross-site scripting. There are a couple of simple ways. I mean, you can add it in a global ASEX. You can add, like, to every request those specific headers. But this method allows you to really fine-tune the methods that are allowed to do cross-site scripting. Maybe you have a bunch of methods or controllers which are only for internal use, and you have a couple that you want to expose. And by using this package, you will have a really nice way of specifying what is allowed to be used by cross-site scripting and what is not allowed with cross-site scripting. The way that that works is pretty straightforward. I can go to the values controller, and I can, let me add a little code fragment here. Because I have added this package to my project, I am now able to decorate this controller by the enable course attribute. And in this case, I am exposing this method to the whole world. And because I've set up authorization, it's not a big deal because you have to be authorized anyway. But I could change the origins, or I could change the headers parameters here to make sure that only calls from a specific origin are allowed on this specific controller. I could also fine-tune this again by specifying an enable course on one of the methods. So I could, let's say, like, the controller is available for everybody except for one method. It has to come from a specific domain or something. So this is pretty straightforward to set up. There is only one thing we need to enable in the application before this is going to be used at runtime, and that is in the startup in the WebAPI config, we have to enable the course as well. So that is going to be done by specifying enable course. Here it is. So in the WebAPI config, I'm enabling the course, and then I can just specify on specific portions in my application what is actually accessible by other domains. And with this in place, we are also able to host this service on, for instance, Azure or on a web server, and access it from other places for the client portion of things. So, okay, I have been showing you the steps on how to get authorized and to do something with this whole credential flow. So you'll see that I have a username and a password, and I'll get a token in return. And that token is going to be sent over with every subsequent call. And if I would code that in JavaScript, it should look a bit like this. So what you see here is that we check if the token is there. And in this case, I'm using the session storage of the browser, which will run my application. And I will get that particular item. If that item is not available, I have to be redirected to some login page, or I have to do something there. And the next thing is that I will prepare, in this case with jQuery, I will perform an AJAX call where I will add the headers, just what you see here. I'm preparing the headers. It's basically the same as what I did manually. So I will have that text bearer, space, and then the whole token. And that is going to be added to the URL. And in this case, we should have values /1, but yeah, that can be any case. And if I switch back to this little application, I mean, I could also get like one of those values, and because I am having this token still here, I could change this to like, I want to have number 1. So this is going to be a call on the same controller. It's using the same authorization. The token still exists and it's still valid because it was valid for like a couple of days. So if I now hit this one, it will get it. The reason that it takes a bit longer is because I probably modified some code. But as you can see, it is still returning values. So this token can be used in this way across all the calls of your application. Until the token expires, you'll get an error message and you have to go through the authorization part again. And instead of using this code, I'm now using the session storage. You can even use the local storage. So that means that if you enter your application, that token will still be stored in your browser. And what is a good thing is that that token is not holding any password information or whatever. It will just hold some information on who you are, but it doesn't have your credentials or anything in there. And if you want to get into it, you have to decode it as well. And there are a couple of tools available so you can actually see what is inside that token. But yeah, for us, that's not really really a difficult. It's a bit beyond the scope here. So, but yeah, this is a bit of code. So what I have prepared, and that is also available on NuGet, is something that I'm going to show you. I have created a small JavaScript class which will take care of all of this authorization stuff. And before getting to there, I will show you that code as well. This was basically, this is my test project. This whole test project is available on GitHub as well, so you can just download it and play around with it. This web API server has a bit more information in it. It's got a little film database. But the most important thing that I would like to show you here is this particular JavaScript file. I'm not going to go over every details, but I do want to point out a couple of things here. And that is, for instance, we have this Web API client class. This is the class that I have been creating, and this, I mean, I've tested this with our own DevExtreme product, which is a JavaScript framework, but it should be working with other clients as well. But the most interesting things here is that we will actually do that whole bearer-based token stuff. We will do it here. So as soon as we post something, you will see that I will add those headers for you. And if those headers are not available, you'll get an error back. You can actually trigger to be redirected to some login page. And if we're going to run this application, let me see this one. Let me make it a startup project. So this is actually part of our DevExtreme product, but I won't go too deep into that. If you want to know more about this whole stuff that you're seeing right now, please visit our booth, and I'll be more than happy to show you a really nice demo on it. What we actually have here is the values controller, which was already in there. And in this case, the server returned an error. And that is, let me check the other one as well, the films one. That's more interesting, I guess. Okay, so that's a bit... Let me check it one more time. What this should basically do is it should be redirecting you to a login page where you will actually need to enter your username and your password, and it will get that token, and it will be used across the life cycle of your application. Let me have a quick check why the application is... Oh yeah, I know why the application is not working. That is obviously because I didn't start up this particular backend. It's more or less the same, but it's got a bit more data here. So let me boot this one up. Yeah, and you can use this JavaScript, and you can even modify it any way you like it. It's just to give you a head start, because I found it to be difficult to find information on the web, like how does this work with JavaScript and how am I going to get it going. There are like a lot of fragmented articles, so I spent some time putting this together in one little JavaScript class. Okay, so what we see here is that we have, it is going to ask me for, I was going to the films database, and it's redirecting me directly to this particular login page. What I've also put in is a register page. So if you didn't register already, it will just go, and I will give myself another email address here. With another password. And okay, so even the Web API is giving me an error back, which I'm just promoting here, that it should have one capital. So that was something I didn't do. And it is now going to register my account here, if I'm not mistaken. And I should be able to sign in and get the information that I want. So if I go back here, well, the server requires me to log in. and it should now be validated against my backend. I think it's going to set up a database right now, because for the rest there wasn't anything prepared, I guess. And yeah, the screens that you see here are basically screens which come from DevExtreme, but as I said, it's just to give me a quick way of displaying this information for you. The main code is obviously be coded in here, which will do the whole authorization part, and once things are not going to be authorized for some reason, you'll be redirected to a registration page if you want to. And what I also tested is that this will run on a real device. So if you use this particular client application and you will ship that on a mobile application inside your, which is built with Cordova and PhoneGap, it will work as well, because there are a couple of things that you need to be aware of, specifically with a third-party authentication. And that is handled properly as well. So I will actually check if we're dealing with Cordova, and we'll do a couple of different things. Because with Cordova, you need to have a pop-up available, which will, if you want to authorize through Facebook, you will have this pop-up from Facebook, which you will need to confirm whether you want to give access. And what you also see here is it is one of the endpoints that I didn't discuss, but we can also ask on the Web API what external providers are being configured. And in our particular case, there wasn't anything configured, but you just saw me pop up the code. In Web API, there is some code available which is commented out by default. So if I go back to the identity config, sorry, to the startup.auth file, this is by default put in comment inside your code. So if you want to use, for instance, Facebook authentication, you need to enter the app ID and the app secret, which you will be getting from Facebook in this case, and you need to put that in the application, and that means that your Web API can be authorized by Facebook as well. For that, you will also need to set up an application at Facebook itself. Let me put down the mic quickly. So if you go to developer.facebook.com, my Wi-Fi connection is gone. If you go to developer.facebook.com, you can actually register an application. You will need to enter a couple of things, and in return you will get that app ID and that app secret. That app secret should only be used on the server side, and the app ID can be used on the client as well, as long as you don't put two of them together in your client application, because it's like a secret. And with that in place, even your Web API controller takes care of the whole authorization part through Facebook or Twitter or any of the other social platforms. And well, that is obviously something which is happening more and more. So you'll have another party deal with securing your account information, and you will only get that secure token back from that party, and you can use that token to have your users authorized through your Web API. So I think we're almost finished. There are obviously a couple of best practices that I would like to point out. These days I would definitely recommend, if you're going to put your Web API in the big world out there, I would recommend using things like SSL to secure your Web API backend as well. It's just like an extra security layer. And I would definitely use the authorized attributes on controllers, methods, that kind of stuff. And you can also decorate your controllers with a require HTTPS attribute, to make sure that it will only run on HTTPS. You can read more about it on this link. Another thing is obviously that you will need to have a documented API. If you create your API and you want to expose it to other people, you will have to document it because people don't know what they're doing on your backend. So it is important that you will have all those endpoints documented. And as you saw, WebAPI, the project template helps you out quite a bit, because if I would add another controller to my project, you'll see that the documentation is already updated as well. Well, a couple of best practices here are like keep it simple, KISS. Yeah, have like a good design of your API. I mean, think about it really good. If you take a look at the little picture here, you'll have like a well, more or less name-based convention. Well, WebAPI deals with that automatically, so that's helping you out quite a bit. It is using the verbs. I mean, what you also saw here, let me switch back to Visual Studio quickly. What you saw in the values controller is that you can decorate certain things here with a HTTP post. Oh, it's not being done here, but there are actually attributes which specify whether you want to have a post or a get or a put. And you can decorate those methods here, so use that as well. So if somebody's trying to fool you with a get while you're expecting a post or something, it's just not going to work. And WebAPI will deal with that. Yeah, well, a lot of APIs have like a development API as well, some sort of a sandbox. So specifically, if you want to have like third parties working on your API, you need to test new features in a sandbox without doing a full deploy to the real API, basically. You can use things like the cloud to set your web API backend up. So you can use Azure, you can use Amazon. Well, Azure makes it quite simple to get you going. You saw the project template. I can tick a box and it will be deployed to Azure as well. And they can also measure the traffic for you, which might be interesting. I mean, a lot of APIs are dealing with pricing, depending on the traffic that you use. And then there are things like Swagger, which makes it easy for you to document your web API. So you can put attributes on top of your methods, and Swagger is a little tool, and it will find those attributes, and it will create a nice documentation section for your site, even better as the one that you already saw. So that is all things to think about when you go public. And with that, I think we are a bit over time on the session. But yeah, if you have any questions about it, please ask them. Otherwise, I would like to thank you for attending. And if you want to know more about it, visit our booth, and I'll be more than happy to tell you a bit more about it. Thank you very much.